everyone. Today we will be discussing Chapter 1 and just providing a brief run through of various theories of development. And so what we see on the second slide is that science defines theories differently than the way we use them or talk about them in everyday life. And so a scientific theory leads to hypotheses, which ultimately leads us to test that theory. And so the key attribute there being something that is testable and also helps to make predictions of human behavior. So in this chapter, we'll discuss developmental theories that have had some historical impact on the field, but what we see is that not all of them are currently being used or even supported. So as we discuss them, think about the pieces of these theories that continue to influence psychology today. And so the 5 theories that we will discuss include psychoanalytic, cognitive, behavioral, and social cognitive, ethological, and ecological. And so first we see psychoanalytic theories with Freud. And so Freud was one of the first to try to develop a systematic theory of the workings of the human mind. And so his theory asserts that behavior is primarily unconscious, driven by sexual and aggressive drives, that your early experience is important, and as what we'll see with the psychosexual stages, all of these have some impact on your behavior later in adult life, and that your behavior is symbolic. And so one of those examples is what we typically call a Freudian slip. So since the introduction of his theory, it has been significantly revised throughout the years. So you may ask why, and the answer is that parts of his theory is actually not testable, and it is described as an oversimplification of human behavior. For example, the unconscious mind, we don't really know what that is or what it looks like, and therefore it's not testable because we're unaware of it. But within this particular theory, he theorized or believed that there was an unconscious mind that is driving our behavior. And so here we see the psychosexual stages. And as you can see within the psychosexual stages of development by Freud, it really spans from birth to adulthood. And there are key things about the theory that were significant in influencing psychology today, which include early life experiences are really important to human development. And so broadly, that's what we can take away from his psychosexual stages. Problems with the theory include the development of this theory was entirely based on case study methodology, meaning that it's based on a very limited number of individuals, say one particular individual. Given that type of methodology, there were no controls or randomization of study participants, and if you don't have those, your ability to generalize to the general population is limited to non-existent. And also we see just an overall or an overemphasis on sexual and aggressive drives concerning lifespan development. And so switching gears and talking about Erik Erikson, so he's still within the psychoanalytic theory framework, and he recognized Freud's contribution to the field, but thought he didn't account for some important factors. Namely, these factors, and what you'll notice is this emphasis on children's psychological and social development. And specifically within Erik Erikson, he focused on issues involving us living in human groups and also the culture that accompanies that environment. So that may make more sense when we look at the next slide and actually look at the specific stages within the psychosocial theory. And so dissimilar from Freud, he believed that development is lifelong and it just doesn't end within early adulthood. And so here we see 8 stages of development that occur throughout the lifespan based on Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory. And so for healthy psychological and social development to actually occur, conflicts or questions that occur within each stage need to be resolved in favor of the positive trait or the outcome. For example, in the trust stage, as we can see on the first one, if a child goes through this crisis or this conflict of knowing or asking, will someone come when I cry? Will they meet my needs? Am I priority to someone? And if we fast forward to the generativity stage, where the conflict includes older adults asking themselves whether their lives were lived fulfilled, or have they fulfilled their lives. And so this can result in a concern for helping the younger generation and also just leaving a legacy for themselves and for their families. And so if they actually do not resolve this conflict, it may result in stagnation or just staying within that stage. And within stage 7, where we were giving that example, it may actually lead to an individual experiencing a midlife crisis. And so here we have cognitive theories of development. And so the first one we talk about is Piaget. And he theorized that children actively construct their environment and are not just passive recipients of input like the psychosexual stages by Freud in the unconscious mind. So we're active within our environment. And all individuals progress through 4 stages, as we'll see in the next slide. Individuals' development occurs through assimilation and accommodation. And so what we see is that individuals essentially integrate and develop these ways of thinking throughout their lifetime. And so Piaget's cognitive theory is the ultimate stage theory that focuses just on qualitative changes that we can see within people's thoughts and their complexity and the operation of those thoughts. For example, when you're working with kiddos, if you want them to really understand what you're talking about, you want to use concrete examples, short sentences, and be direct, rather than using some type of abstract language or even using metaphors, because children, depending on what stage they're in within this cognitive development, may or may not understand. Piaget's theory, however, what we can see from just the different stages is that he tended to underestimate the abilities of young children, though the basics of his theory are correct, as we can see today through empirical studies. So Vygotsky, he theorized that development of children occurs when they're learning to use the tools of their culture, such as language and math. And based on the culture and environment of the kid, it will influence their learning and socializing. For example, different generations, you can see differences between generations learning through pencil and paper methods versus computers. So learning through interaction with more skilled individuals is described as indispensable to children's cognitive development under Vygotsky. And so Montessori programs that you may see in your communities often come from this perspective. So overall, what we see with cognitive stages are that they're very different from psychoanalytic approaches in that the individual takes this active role within their development. It has a very positive view of development, and it notes important changes in the nature of thoughts, like its development of their complexity of thoughts and how individuals actually perceive events and how that impacts their thoughts about themselves, about other people, and about their environment. And ultimately what we see within cognitive theories is that it's comprised of testable hypotheses. And here we switch to behaviorism, and behaviorist theories believe that scientifically we can only study what can be observed and what can be measured. And they also believe that the development, that children's development is observable behavior that can be learned through their experience with their environment. And so in our presentation, I'll briefly discuss Skinner's operant conditioning and Bandor's social cognitive theory. And most, if not all, of these theories you probably remember from your intro to psych class. So here we have behaviorists, and particularly B.F. Skinner. And so behaviorists, ultimately, they view children's behavior as reflecting operant conditioning principles. In this view, children are passively shaped by reinforcers or punishers that follow their behavior. For example, if a mother gives in and gets her kid that candy bar that he just threw a tantrum for in the store, his behavior is reinforced. Alternatively, if the child was put into timeout for that tantrum, his behavior was punished. So given this perspective, there's a heavy environmental influence. And for young children, just for an example, that's going to be their parents and their teachers. So next, your chapter talks about Albert Bandura and Walter Mischel. And these individuals believe that cognitive processes are important mediators of that environment to behavior connection. So in other words, learning occurs through observing what others do, as individuals cognitively represent what they see and adopt that behavior themselves. So this type of learning is protective, but it's also adaptive. If so, one example of that is if we see someone else getting in trouble for a certain behavior, we think, or we have this form that thoughts that that's not a good idea, and that ultimately influences our behavior, and we will not engage in that particular behavior. We also see various contributions from the social cognitive approach, including the emphasis on the importance of scientific research, the focus on the environmental determinants of behavior, and the importance of observational learning through experience with the environment. So next, we see the ethological or evolutionary theory of development. And note that the book does present a very simplistic view of the evolutionary viewpoint. Within the chapter, it discusses Darwin's theory of humans being born with adaptive traits that evolve through the process of natural selection and also functionality, and this ultimately channeled their development to promote survival. And so one example of something a very young infant does to promote its own survival is to smile. It's an adaptive trait that serves to promote survival by increasing the probability of receiving affection, of attention, and just meeting their basic needs by someone in their environment. So humans are intensely social species, and social life has the heaviest consequences for success, like making friends and forming relationships with people. And human groups are inherently unpredictable, so strategies, traits that promote survival have varied somewhat through our evolutionary history, more so than for some other species like alligator. So those that were invariant, like the shape of the human face, will universally gain an infant's attention. So they are more universal and less plastic, and so they're less likely to change over time. Those that were variant, as in the context of being shifted or changing from generation to generation, are more plastic and apt to be shaped by the social context. And one example of that are attachment styles. So from this perspective, the purpose for the developmental period is to allow time for the individual to refine what is necessary to be a more successful adult. And across species, looking at the length of developmental period, these give cues to how plastic or moldable their brains are, and also to their evolutionary heritage. So primates like us have some of the longest developmental periods, elephants and dolphins too. And among all of these species is this common characteristic of being very social. And so that's something important to remember from this particular theory. Lastly, we have the ecological theory of development. And as you can see in the picture, Bronfenbrenner described development as transactions and interactions between you, other individuals, and your environment. At each level or system is a different environment that you interact with and ultimately influences you as a person, whether that's psychologically, socially, and also behaviorally. So initially he described 4 systems ranging from the micro system all the way to the macro system, but then later added the influence of biological aspects. And given the description of each of these theories, as you can see within the picture and within the chapter, you can start to see how psychology today has taken pieces of each of not only the ecological theory, but all of the theories that we briefly discussed today, how we've taken pieces of each of them to understand human behavior. And so these so-called pieces are now based on empirical studies and literature that help to support their presence or ultimately their influence on people's lives.